The dust of Redwater Ridge settled on everything. A fine crimson powder that coated windowsills, soured the water in the horse troughs, and clung to the hopeful white paint of the new church. It was the color of the canyons that bled into the sky at sunset, the color of the rust-tinged creek that gave the town its name. And tonight, it felt to Abigail Sutton like the color of happiness itself. At 22 years old, she was the daughter of the town blacksmith, a man whose grief for his late wife had been hammered into a silent, stoic strength. Tomorrow, she would be a wife herself. Her husband-to-be was Jebediah Turner, a man of 26 whose ambitions were as gentle and steady as his hands on a horse's reins. He did not dream of gold or glory, only of a small horse ranch nestled against the foothills, a place where the grass grew thick and the water ran clear. He was a good man, a kind man, and Abigail loved him with a quiet certainty that felt as solid as the anvil in her father's smithy. On this night before their wedding, the whole of Redwater Ridge seemed to be celebrating with them. The sound of a badly tuned piano and raucous laughter spilled from the Copper Lantern Saloon, its polished namesake sign glowing like a lone, warm star against the deepening twilight. Inside, cowboys and railroad men drank and gambled, their boisterous energy a testament to the town's fragile prosperity. May Pike, the saloon's owner, moved among them with a wit as sharp as her whiskey was strong, her presence a firm but fair hand on the pulse of the town's rowdier element. Watching the town from a distance was Sheriff Morgan Hayes. At 38, he was a man more legend than conversation. They called him Longshot, a name earned years ago when he single-handedly dismantled the Black Antelope gang with a series of rifle shots that defied distance and logic. Now, he kept the peace in Redwater Ridge with a quiet watchfulness that discouraged trouble before it began. A pale scar cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a past he never spoke of. He was known for his unerring aim, but also for a peculiar brand of mercy, a tendency to shoot to wound, not to kill, leaving room for justice rather than just vengeance. He saw the joy of the town, and he saw the shadows that joy cast. One of those shadows was Ezra Crow, a man in his 40s with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that offered everything but warmth. Crow was the town's foremost businessman, a land broker for the expanding railroad. He held mortgages, swayed juries, and wielded influence with the silent deadliness of a rustler in the night. His gaze often lingered on the Sutton property, a prime piece of land bordering the creek. It was the perfect location for the new water tower the railroad would need. And Crow was a man who always got what he wanted. He had made offers, polite at first, then laced with a certain pressure, but Abigail's father had refused every time. The smithy was their home, their legacy. Abigail paid the town's undercurrents no mind tonight. She sat in the small room behind the smithy, the air thick with the familiar scents of coal and hot iron. Before her, laid out on the bed, was her wedding dress, her mother's lace, painstakingly mended and cleaned, adorned the collar and cuffs. Old Hank, her father's longtime assistant, had gifted her a set of small, polished steel buttons he had forged himself. She touched the delicate fabric, her heart a fluttering bird in her chest. Soon, Jeb would be here. They had planned to share a quiet moment before the town's revelry swept him away for his final night as a single man. But the minutes stretched into an hour. The laughter from the Copper Lantern grew louder, the piano more insistent. A knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. Jeb was never late. He was as reliable as the sunrise. She walked to the front of the smithy, peering down the dusty main street. The setting sun had set the red cliffs ablaze, but there was no sign of his familiar, loping walk. Her father came in from the forge, wiping his hands on an oily rag. He saw the look on her face and his own expression, usually as hard as the iron he worked, softened. He told her Jeb was probably just held up with his friends, celebrating a little too hard. He advised her to get some rest. Tomorrow was the most important day of her life. She tried. She lay down on her bed, The beautiful dress a pale ghost beside her, but sleep would not come. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the scent of the coming dust storm, a precursor to the dry season. Every footstep outside made her heart leap, only to fall again when it passed her door. It was well past midnight when she saw it. A small, folded piece of paper propped against the water pitcher on her washstand. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was Jeb's handwriting, plain and clear. The note contained only 4 words: "For your future." The words made no sense. They were a puzzle with no pieces, a key to a lock she could not find. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She ran outside, calling his name into the wind. The only answer was the rattling of the smithy sign and the distant, fading sounds from the saloon. He was gone. The man who was to be her husband, the man who was her future, had vanished without a word of explanation, leaving only a cryptic message behind. The dawn broke gray and heavy, the air thick with the dust the wind had carried through the night. The town awoke slowly, but news, like tumbleweeds, traveled fast. Abigail had not slept. She sat in a wooden chair, the note clutched in her hand, her wedding dress still lying on the bed, a symbol of a promise that now felt like a cruel joke. Her father had gone out at first light, his face a mask of grim determination, seeking answers. He returned with nothing but the sour taste of gossip, a stable hand, eager for a moment of importance. Claimed to have seen Jeb Turner riding out of town late last night. He was not alone. He was flanked by 2 men, riders known to be in the employ of Ezra Crow. The rumor spread through Redwater Ridge like a prairie fire. By mid-morning, it was all anyone spoke of. Jeb Turner had run off. He had jilted the blacksmith's daughter on the very eve of their wedding. The whispers followed Abigail like a second shadow. She could feel the pitying glances, the sharp, judgmental stares, as if she were somehow to blame. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Had she not been good enough? Was their poverty a burden he could no longer bear? The questions tore at her, each one more painful than the last. Deputy Tom Reed, a young man earnest but out of his depth, came by to ask a few clumsy questions and offer his condolences, which sounded more like an accusation. Reverend Whitlow spoke in hushed, somber tones about the trials of faith. Even Dr. Beasley, a man of science, could only shake his head and murmur about the strange workings of the human heart. It was then that Sheriff Morgan Hayes appeared at her door. He did not offer empty platitudes or pious sentiments. He simply stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway, his gaze steady and direct. He looked at the crushed note in her hand, at the unshed tears in her eyes, at the wedding dress that lay like a shroud on her bed. His voice, when he spoke, was low and dry as the dust outside. He told her a simple thing: "You are not alone in Redwater." The words were not a comfort, not exactly. They were a statement of fact, a promise of presence. He stepped inside, his spurs making a soft, metallic sound on the wooden floor. He told her he was opening an official investigation. He asked her questions, not about her feelings, but about the facts. When had she last seen Jeb? Did he own a fine horse? Did he have any enemies? His methodical approach was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He left as quietly as he had arrived, but later that day, Abigail saw him. He was not in his office or in the saloon. He was out near the unfinished railway station at the edge of town, walking slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground. He was a man reading a story written in the dirt. From her window, she watched him work. He knelt, examining the earth with an intensity that seemed to block out the rest of the world. He was tracing the tracks of horses, measuring their stride, noting their shoeing. He followed the trail to a barbed wire fence that bordered the railroad's property. There, something white caught his eye. He reached out a gloved hand and gently untangled it from a metal barb. Even from a distance, Abigail knew what it was: a small, ragged scrap of lace. Her mother's lace, a piece of her wedding dress, torn and stained with the red mud of Redwater Ridge. A broken promise, snagged on the fence that represented the very future Crow was so eager to control. Sheriff Hayes stood there for a long time, the small piece of fabric resting in his palm. As he studied the ground again, his gaze sharpened. Among the chaotic prints of shod horses, there was something else, something that did not belong. Faint but unmistakable in the soft dirt were the impressions of a different kind of footwear, the distinct heel and sole of a military officer's boot. It was a detail that made no sense. Jeb Turner was a cowboy. He had never been a soldier. The sheriff looked from the torn lace to the strange boot print, and the simple story of a runaway groom began to fray, revealing the edges of something far more complex and dangerous. A quiet storm was gathering, and its first victim was a promise made to a blacksmith's daughter. The church bell tolled, but it was not a sound of celebration. Each strike fell upon the dusty air of Redwater Ridge with the heavy finality of a funeral dirge. Inside the small wooden church, the pews were filled not with joyous guests, but with curious, whispering spectators. They had come to witness a tragedy, a public unraveling, and they sat with a grim, pious anticipation. Abigail Sutton stood before the altar. The mended lace of her mother's dress felt like a coarse shroud against her skin. The polished steel buttons, a gift of love from old Hank, seemed as cold and heavy as tiny stones. Her father stood beside her, his hand a rigid weight on her arm, his face carved from the same stubborn iron he shaped at his forge. He was a silent bastion of support in a sea of murmuring condemnation. The space beside her, where Jebediah Turner should have been, was a hollow ache, an absence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Reverend Whitlow wrung his hands, his Bible held tightly in his trembling fingers. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and uncertain in the strained silence. He began to speak of commitments and promises, but his words faltered, tripping over the palpable truth in the room. This was not a union. It was a public declaration of abandonment. The whispers grew louder, ugly little barbs of speculation. They said she must have driven him off. They said her poverty was too great a price for any man to pay. Each whispered word was a fresh grain of salt rubbed into the raw wound of her humiliation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church swung open, spilling a rectangle of harsh afternoon light down the center aisle. A figure stood silhouetted against the glare, a man whose presence immediately silenced the whispers and drew every eye. Ezra Crow stepped inside, his polished boots making a confident, rhythmic sound on the wooden floorboards. He walked with the unhurried air of a man who owned any room he entered. He was dressed impeccably, his dark suit a stark contrast to the dusty work clothes of the other men. He stopped a few feet from the altar, his expression a careful mask of solemn concern. He addressed Abigail, his voice smooth and resonant, carrying to every corner of the small church. He spoke of the unfortunate circumstances, a terrible blight on a day that should have been her happiest. He presented himself not as an observer, but as a potential savior. He offered a solution to her public disgrace. He proposed what he called a marriage of honor. He, Ezra Crow, would take her as his wife. Right here, right now. He would give her his name, his protection. He would silence the gossip and restore her standing. The offer hung in the air, audacious and suffocating. It was not a kindness, but a cage. When Abigail found her voice, it was rough with unshed tears, but steady with a core of iron she had inherited from her father. She refused him. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the church with the force of a slammed door. Crow's smile did not falter. He had anticipated her refusal. He moved to his second offer, his true purpose. If she would not accept his name, then perhaps she would accept his gold. He would buy the Sutton smithy and the land it stood on, every last acre down to the creek. He named a price that was generous, even extravagant. It was enough money for her and her father to leave Redwater Ridge, to start anew somewhere the shame of this day could not follow them. He promised to ensure the world knew she had left a wealthy woman. not a jilted bride? Before Abigail could answer, another voice cut through the charged atmosphere, sharp and clear. May Pike, who had been standing near the back, pushed her way forward. She looked at Crow. Her eyes narrowed. She told him that a woman's honor was not a piece of property to be bought or sold at his convenience. Then she turned her gaze on the crowd, her hands on her hips. She told the men in the pews that if any one of them had a word to say about Abigail Sutton that was not kind, they could say it to her first, and then they would find themselves drinking at the horse trough for a month. A few of the men shifted uncomfortably, their smug expressions dissolving. May had given Abigail something more valuable than gold. She had given her a moment of fierce, unwavering alliance. It was into this standoff that Sheriff Morgan Hayes walked. He had entered so quietly that no one had noticed him until he was standing beside May. He did not look at Crow or at the congregation. His eyes were on Abigail. He said her name, just that. It was not a question or a command, but a simple acknowledgement. He told her he would walk her home. The walk from the church to the smithy was a silent procession through a gauntlet of staring eyes. But the nature of the stares had changed. They were no longer just looking at a woman scorned. They were looking at a woman escorted by the law, by the most legendary man in the territory. The whispers died in their throats. Inside the smithy, the air was cool and smelled of steel and coal smoke. It was a relief after the suffocating piety of the church. Hayes closed the door, shutting out the prying eyes of the town. Abigail finally let the tears she had been holding back fall, hot and silent. Her father moved to the forge, his back to them, the rigid set of his shoulders a testament to his own pain and anger. Sheriff Hayes did not speak. He unpinned the silver star from his vest. It was heavy, worn smooth by years of service. He walked over to the massive anvil that stood in the center of the room, the heart of her family's life and work. With a quiet, deliberate motion, he placed the badge on the flat, scarred surface of the anvil. The small piece of silver on the vast expanse of black iron was a stark and powerful symbol. It was a promise. It was the law, placing itself squarely in her home, on her side. He then turned his attention to the business of his investigation. He spent the afternoon asking questions around town, his presence a quiet and persistent pressure. He visited the railroad freight office, inquiring about any unusual cargo manifests or passenger lists. The clerk, a man known to be in Crow's pocket, was evasive and forgetful. Hayes simply stood there, his patience a more effective tool than any threat, until the man reluctantly produced the logs. At the same time, he sent Deputy Reed to get a list of all the men on Ezra Crow's payroll, a task that proved difficult as most were hired for cash, their names as transient as the dust. Abigail, left alone in the silence of the smithy, felt a new kind of resolve hardening within her. The humiliation had burned away the soft edges of her hope, leaving behind something tougher, more resilient. She would not be a victim. She would not hide and wait for others to decide her fate. She went to the back room and opened the old wooden chest where her father kept his hunting rifle. It was a carbine, heavy and smelling of oil and wood smoke. She carried it out into the yard behind the smithy, her movements clumsy but determined. She did not know the first thing about firearms, but she knew she could not stand to feel so helpless ever again. She was trying to figure out how to load a cartridge when a shadow fell over her. Sheriff Hayes was standing there, watching her. She expected him to disapprove, to take the rifle from her. Instead, he simply asked her what she was doing. She told him she was learning to protect herself. He nodded slowly. For a long moment, he just watched her fumble with the weapon. Then, in his sparse, practical way, he began to instruct her. He showed her how to stand, how to balance her weight. He adjusted her grip, his hands briefly touching hers, his touch impersonal and professional. He taught her how to sight down the barrel, how to align the front and rear sights until they formed a perfect picture. He spoke of breathing, of how to exhale slowly until her body was still, until the moment was calm. Her hands were trembling, the heavy rifle shaking with the force of her turmoil. "I am shaking," she said, her voice small. Hayes looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then shoot slow," he replied, his voice even. "Slow is how you stay alive." The words settled in her, a piece of practical wisdom that cut through her fear. It was not advice about shooting. It was advice about living. When you are shaking, when your world is falling apart, move slowly, be deliberate. That is how you survive. Later that evening, after he was satisfied that she could safely handle the unloaded weapon, Hayes continued his work. A hunch, born from the sight of the officer's boot print and the railroad clerk's nervousness, took him to Crow's main supply warehouse near the rail yard. He used his authority as sheriff to demand a look inside, a move that earned him a venomous glare from Crow's foreman, but no actual resistance. The warehouse was vast and filled with the tools of progress, crates of steel spikes, barrels of tar, stacks of fresh timber. Hayes moved through the aisles, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows. He was not sure what he was looking for. He was searching for anything out of place, anything that connected to Jebediah Turner. In a dark corner, half hidden beneath a dusty canvas tarp, he found a wooden crate that was different from the others. It was not marked with the railroad's insignia. He pried open the lid. Inside, nestled in straw, were not railroad supplies. He saw several boxes of ammunition, but what caught his eye was something else. Tucked in beside the ammunition were several discarded canvas cartridge pouches, the kind issued by the United States Army. They were empty, but the markings were clear. It was military surplus, something a civilian land broker had no business possessing. The discovery was a small, hard piece of a puzzle, clicking into place beside the memory of a military boot print in the mud. The simple story of a jilted bride and a runaway groom was gone. In its place was the beginning of a darker, more dangerous truth, its tendrils reaching out from the past and coiling around the future of Redwater Ridge. Sheriff Morgan Hayes laid the military surplus cartridge pouches on his desk. They felt wrong. In a town built on cattle and the coming railroad, these remnants of a formal conflict were an unwelcome anomaly. They spoke of a different kind of violence, more disciplined and colder than a saloon brawl. Coupled with the memory of the officer's boot print he had found by the fence, they formed a question he could not yet answer. He needed more than hunches. His next stop was the railroad office, where he found the same nervous clerk he had questioned before. This time, Hayes did not ask. He stated that a crime had been committed on railroad property and that he was impounding all records from the previous 72 hours. The clerk's protest died in his throat under the sheriff's flat, unblinking gaze. Back in his own office, amidst the smell of stale coffee and oiled leather, Hayes began the painstaking process of sifting through the paperwork. He found it tucked inside a ledger. It was a standard railroad labor contract, the kind that signed a man over for months of grueling work in exchange for a meager wage. But this one was different. The signature at the bottom was shaky, the ink pressed so deeply into the paper that it had bled slightly. Still, the name was unmistakable: Jebediah Turner. Beneath it was a second document, a one-way train ticket to the work camps far to the west. The passenger's name had been left blank. It was a ghost ticket for a ghost of a man, signed away under duress. As he was staring at the forced signature, Deputy Tom Reed burst in, his young face flushed with a mixture of excitement and fear. He had been spending his evenings in the Copper Lantern, not drinking, but listening. He had overheard a drover talking to one of Crow's men, a story about the night of the wedding. The drover had seen 3 riders heading out of town, moving fast. They wore dark coats, and each man had a black band tied around his upper arm. They had taken the old trail that led past the back of the Sutton property. 3 men, organized and anonymous. It was no longer just a disappearance. It was an abduction. Hayes knew he had to tell Abigail. He walked to the smithy, the papers heavy in his hand. He found her in the yard, practicing with the unloaded carbine. Her movements were becoming less clumsy, more certain. There was a hard set to her jaw that had not been there 2 days ago. He showed her the contract. She traced Jebediah's name with her finger, her touch gentle, as if the paper itself held some memory of him. She saw the desperation in the jagged lines of his signature, the terror of a man signing away his freedom. She knew then, with absolute certainty, that he had not abandoned her out of choice. He had been taken. A new kind of grief, sharper and more frightening than the sting of betrayal, took hold of her. It was the grief of the unknown. Was he alive? Was he hurt? The questions were a torment. Acting on the information from Deputy Reed, she insisted on riding out with the sheriff. She would not wait passively in town while the man she loved was in danger. Hayes, seeing the iron resolve in her eyes, did not argue. They followed the dry creek bed away from town, the hooves of their horses kicking up puffs of red dust. The drought was taking hold. The once gurgling stream was now just a ribbon of cracked mud and thirsty stones. The sun beat down, and the air was still and hot. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Abigail scanned the landscape, her eyes searching for any sign, any clue, while Hayes watched the trail, his gaze missing nothing. The trail led them to an abandoned mining stakeout, a place of shallow pits and discarded equipment, a monument to some long-forgotten hope of finding silver. In the center of the clearing was the dead gray circle of an old campfire, and in that circle was a small, dark mound of ash. Abigail slid from her horse before it had even come to a full stop. She knew, with a dreadful instinct, what she would find. She knelt beside the ashes, her hands hovering over them, afraid to touch. A faint, acrid smell of burnt fabric still hung in the air. There, amongst the charred wood, was a recognizable shape, a ghostly outline of lace, blackened and brittle, a single, small steel button. One of old Hank's lay half buried in the ash, its polished surface now dull and gray. It was her veil, the symbol of her dreams, the repository of her hopes for a future with Jebediah, had been consumed by fire, reduced to nothing but dust and a single, sad piece of metal. A sound, a low cry of pure anguish, escaped her lips. She sagged, her strength giving way, and she would have collapsed into the ashes if Hayes had not moved. He was beside her in an instant, but he did not offer words of comfort. He knew that words were useless against such a profound and final loss. Instead, he took off his long canvas duster, the one he always wore, and draped it around her shoulders. He pulled the collar up, shielding her face from the wind that had begun to whip dust around them. It was a simple, practical gesture, an act of pure, unadorned protection. He did not touch her further, but stood there, a silent, solid presence between her and the harsh, indifferent landscape, his coat a shield against the world. When they returned to Redwater Ridge, the atmosphere had grown even fouler. Ezra Crowe, seeing that legal pressure and financial offers had failed, had resorted to a more ancient and insidious weapon slander. A new story was circulating, a poison whispered over fences and in the general store. The story claimed that Jebediah Turner had not been taken. He had fled. And he had fled because he had discovered that his bride-to-be was not the virtuous woman she pretended to be. The rumor was given wings by small, crudely printed leaflets that appeared all over town, tacked to notice boards and hitching posts, left on the benches outside the church. They did not name Abigail directly, but they spoke of a recent, scandalous event and asked pointed questions about a bride's honor. Abigail found one on the door of the smithy, held in place by a dab of axle grease. She tore it down, her hands shaking with rage. The insinuation was so vile, so baseless, that it left her feeling soiled. She watched as her father read it, saw the color drain from his face, replaced by a dark, helpless fury. This was an attack they could not fight with hammers and tongs. It was an attempt to destroy the only thing they had left their good name. For an afternoon, Abigail stayed inside. The four walls of the smithy a prison of shame. The whispers of the town felt like a physical assault, But as the hours wore on, the heat of her anger began to burn away the chill of her fear. The memory of Sheriff Hayes's quiet, steady presence, of his coat shielding her from the wind, gave her a sliver of strength. She would not be defined by Ezra Crow's lies. She would not be trampled. She washed her face, put on a clean dress, and walked out of the smithy. She did not hurry. She walked with a deliberate, measured pace, her head held high, directly to the center of town, where the market was still busy. A hush fell over the crowd as she approached. People stopped their haggling, their conversations dying away. As they turned to stare, she ignored them. She walked to the main town notice board, where another one of the hateful leaflets was posted. She pulled it from the board. Then, she reached into the small pocket of her apron and took out a heavy, square-headed horseshoe nail from the leather sheath on her belt. She drew a small tack hammer, a tool of her trade, with a clear, ringing sound that echoed in the sudden silence. She hammered the leaflet back onto the post. Then, she turned to face the stunned crowd. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the still air, clear and strong as a bell. She said, "I was betrayed on my wedding night." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting them see the truth of her pain. Then she finished, "But honor is what a person keeps after they have been trampled." She turned and walked away, leaving the crowd in a state of shocked silence. She had not denied the rumor. She had risen above it. She had taken their ugliest weapon and refused to be wounded by it. Sheriff Hayes had seen the whole thing from the doorway of his office. A slow, deep respect for the blacksmith's daughter settled in him. Her courage shamed the cowardice of the gossips. He strode over to the notice board, took down the leaflet she had nailed there, and in its place, he posted a new notice, written in his own clear, bold hand. It was an official reward, not a large sum, for any information leading to the whereabouts of Jebediah Turner. It was a public declaration that the law was still looking for him, that he was considered a missing man, not a fugitive from a wedding. That night, Hayes sat at his desk, the light from his lantern casting a small pool of yellow in the darkness. He was cleaning his rifle when a sound like a giant hornet buzzing past his ear was followed by the sharp crack of shattering glass. The window behind him exploded inward. A bullet thudded into the wooden wall just inches from his head, showering him with splinters. It was not a shot meant to kill. It was a warning, a clear message to stop digging. The gunshot echoed in the small office, the sound sharp and violent. It brought everything into focus: the military pouches, the forced contract, the riders with their black armbands, and now, a sniper's bullet. This was not about a piece of land anymore. As Hayes stood up and cautiously peered out into the darkness, his mind raced, fitting the pieces together. The military supplies, the officers' boots, an old case he had worked years ago, before he came to Redwater Ridge. A brutal business involving the railroad and forced labor gangs, a case he thought was long buried. He walked over to a tall, locked cabinet in the corner of his office, a place where old evidence from closed cases was stored and forgotten. He found the key on his ring and opened it. The air inside was stale and dusty. He pulled out a large cardboard box marked with a faded date from 5 years prior. He placed it on his desk and lifted the lid. Inside were bundled reports, a rusted set of shackles, and, at the bottom, a pair of worn, high-quality officer's boots. He took one of the boots out, its leather cracked and dry. He turned it over in the lantern light. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the small notebook where he kept his sketches and observations. He opened it to the page where he had carefully drawn the boot print from the fence line near the railway. He held the boot sole next to the drawing, the pattern of the hobnails, the distinctive wear on the heel, the small, unique nick near the toe. They were a perfect match. The past was not dead. It had followed him to Redwater Ridge, and it was wearing these boots. The morning after the sniper's warning shot, Redwater Ridge awoke to a new and even more audacious assault. Nailed squarely to the front of the general store, where everyone would see it, was a large, professionally printed poster. The ink was a bold black, the kind used for auction notices and election broadsides. But this was no ordinary announcement. In large, dramatic letters, the headline read, "Betrayed on her wedding night. The most legendary sheriff gave her a second chance at love." The town buzzed like a disturbed hive. People gathered in small clumps, pointing and whispering. Their previous gossip now validated and amplified by the authority of the printed word. It was a scandal made official, a piece of private pain turned into public entertainment. The story it told was simple, dramatic, and deeply untrue. It painted Abigail as a fallen woman and Sheriff Hayes as her opportunistic savior, weaving their separate narratives into a single, sordid tale. May Pike stood with her arms crossed, a wry smile playing on her lips as she read the poster. She turned to the small crowd around her and remarked, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the dime novelist who wrote this had a better command of melodrama than Reverend Whitlow. The comment earned a few nervous chuckles, breaking the tension for a moment. Abigail saw it from the door of the smithy. The words seemed to leap across the street, striking her with physical force. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. Her first instinct was to run, to hide from the hundreds of eyes she could feel on her, from the story that was now set in print, a lie that would be harder to erase than a whisper. But then the memory of her own words in the market square returned to her. Honor is what a person keeps after they have been trampled. She would not let them trample her again. She walked out into the street. She did not look at the faces in the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on the poster. As she approached, Sheriff Hayes stepped out from his office. He had already seen it. Their eyes met over the heads of the onlookers. He saw the hurt in her expression, but he also saw the defiance that held her shoulders straight. He walked to the poster without a word. He did not rip it down in anger. With a calm, deliberate motion, he worked the nail free from the wood and took the poster down. He folded it carefully, creasing the cheap paper into a neat, small square, containing the lie within its folds. He walked over to Abigail and held it out to her. She shook her head, unable to touch the vile thing. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Then I will keep it," he said, his voice low and for her alone. "When this is all over, when we can both find a way to laugh about it, we will burn it together." He slipped the folded paper into the inside pocket of his duster. It was a promise of a future she could not yet imagine, a future where this pain would be a distant memory. The poster, however vile, provided an unexpected clue. Dr. Beasley, making his morning rounds, stopped to examine the slanderous leaflets that still littered the town. As a man of science, he had an eye for detail. He remarked to Deputy Reed that the particular shade of purple ink used on them was unusual. It was a new, chemical-based ink, and he had seen it only in one other place on the shipping manifests and contracts in the railroad office. Ezra Crowe had inadvertently signed his name to the slander. The lead was a solid one, but it was another piece of information from Deputy Reed that spurred them to action. The livery stable owner, a man who owed the deputy a favor, had mentioned a late-night rental. A closed carriage, hired by one of Crowe's men, had left town after midnight. It had taken the rough northern track, the one that led out towards the new water pumping stations the railroad was building along the line. There was only one passenger, a figure huddled under a thick blanket, impossible to identify. A pumping station in the middle of nowhere was a strange destination for a secret midnight journey. It was a place to hide a man, or to dispose of one. The thought sent a chill of fear through Abigail. Hayes, seeing the look on her face, made a quick decision. They would ride out to pumping station number 3 immediately. The sky was a strange, bruised yellow as they rode out of town. The air was heavy and still, the oppressive calm that often preceded a violent storm. The drought had left the landscape parched and brittle, and the wind kicked up small devils of red dust that danced across the plains. They rode hard, pushing their horses, a silent urgency passing between them. They were still miles from the station when the sky broke open. It did not start with rain. It started with a sound, a low drumming that grew rapidly into a deafening roar. The first hailstones were the size of pebbles, stinging their faces and spooking the horses. Then they grew larger, to the size of marbles, then acorns. They hammered down with a terrifying force, striking the dry earth and bouncing like white, angry fists. Ahead, through the churning chaos of the storm, they could just make out the shape of a small building, the pump house for the station. It was their only hope for shelter. They urged their horses forward, bending low over their necks to protect their faces from the icy barrage. They reached the small wooden structure and practically fell from their saddles, quickly leading the terrified horses into the relative safety of a small lean-to attached to the side. They stumbled inside the pump house, slamming the door against the fury of the storm. The interior was dark and smelled of oil and damp earth. A large, silent steam engine and pump mechanism filled most of the space. The sound of the hail on the corrugated tin roof was deafening, an incessant, violent drumming that sealed them off from the outside world. Abigail was shivering, her clothes soaked through and her skin chilled by the ice. Hayes took off his heavy canvas duster, the same one he had wrapped around her at the burned-out campfire. It was already damp, but it still held some of his body heat. He draped it over her shoulders, pulling her back against the solid wall of the steam engine, away from the drafty door. He stood close, his body shielding her from the cold, his presence a solid and reassuring warmth in the chaotic darkness. They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside. The violent, percussive sound seemed to strip away all pretense, all the careful defenses they both maintained, in the small, dark space. They were not the legendary sheriff and the jilted bride. They were just two people, taking shelter from a storm. She spoke first, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the hail. She told him about her mother, how she had died when Abigail was just a girl, and how her father had never been the same since, pouring all his words and feelings into the fire and the iron of his work. She spoke of Jebediah, of his simple dream of a horse ranch, a dream that now seemed as fragile and distant as a star. He listened, his silence an invitation to continue. Then, in the same quiet voice, he spoke of his own family. He told her he had a younger brother, somewhere back east. They had not spoken in years. He spoke of his father, a stern man who believed that strength was the only virtue that mattered. He did not speak of the Black Antelope gang or the deeds that had made him a legend. He spoke of the boy he had been, long before the gun and the badge had defined him. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside Abigail's heart. She was here, searching for the man she was supposed to marry, yet she was standing in the dark, wrapped in the coat of another man, a man whose quiet strength and unexpected gentleness were beginning to feel like the only solid ground in her world. She felt a profound sense of guilt, as if her growing feelings for the sheriff were a betrayal of the memory of her love for Jebediah. Hayes, too, was wrestling with his own demons. This woman, with her quiet courage and her deep, honest pain, had breached the walls he had so carefully built around himself. He was afraid. He was afraid that the myth of Longshot Hayes, the killer of outlaws, would inevitably crush the gentle spirit of the woman standing beside him. His legend was a shadow, and he did not want her to have to live in it. The space between them was charged with all the things they were not saying. He looked down at her, his face barely visible in the gloom. He could see the tracks of a single tear on her cheek, silvered by the faint light from a grimy window. Without thinking, he reached out and brushed it away with his thumb. His touch was hesitant, gentle. Her skin was cold. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and questioning. The roar of the hail on the roof seemed to fade into the background. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of comfort. It was slow and uncertain, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared moment of shelter, of the unspoken connection that had grown between them in the midst of chaos and fear. It was a second chance, offered not with a headline, but with a moment of profound, human stillness. When they broke apart, the storm had already begun to subside. The deafening roar softened to a steady drumming, then to a gentle patter. The world outside, cleansed and battered, was re-emerging. They stepped out of the pump house into an afternoon that was strangely bright, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and ozone. The ground was covered in a thick blanket of white hailstones, as if it had snowed in the middle of the summer drought. And there, near the edge of the lean-to, where the hail had washed the red dust from the ground, they saw it. Lying beside a splintered fence post was a length of cut rope. The ends were frayed where it had been sawed through. Pinned beneath one of the strands, half buried in the melting ice, was a small, brass pin. Hayes worked it free. It was a badge, but not a lawman's star. It was the insignia of the railroad's private security force. The evidence was clear. Someone had been tied here, and someone had set him free. Jebediah had not been killed. He had been released. But by whom and for what purpose? Hayes knelt and examined the cut ends of the rope more closely. He ran his thumb over the fibers. The cut was clean, precise. It was not the work of a clumsy farm knife. It had been made with a very sharp, single-edged blade. He had seen cuts like this before. He had made cuts like this before. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The knife that had cut these ropes was a military-issue dagger, a specific model he had carried for years during his time as a railroad investigator. A knife just like the one that was, at this very moment, locked away in the evidence cabinet in his office, tucked inside an old pair of officer's boots. He stood up slowly, the small brass badge cold in his palm, his face a mask of disbelief. The past was no longer just following him. It was impersonating him. The ride back to Redwater Ridge was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The hail had melted, leaving the parched ground pocked and dark with moisture, a fleeting illusion of life in the midst of the drought. A heavy silence stretched between Sheriff Morgan Hayes and Abigail Sutton, thicker and more oppressive than the humid air left by the storm. The simple comfort of their shared kiss in the pump house had been shattered by the discovery of the cut rope, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of a past that belonged to him but now threatened to cut her life to pieces. He rode with his shoulders set, his gaze fixed on the distant, blood-red canyons, but she could see the turmoil in the tight line of his jaw. He was a man wrestling with a phantom, and the phantom was winning. They did not go to the sheriff's office. He followed her to the smithy, the familiar scent of coal and iron a stark contrast to the clean, storm-washed air. Inside, her father was working at the forge, the rhythmic ring of his hammer on steel a steady, angry heartbeat in the quiet building. He looked up as they entered, his eyes questioning, but a glance at their faces told him this was a conversation for them alone. He gave a curt nod and returned to his work, the furious ringing of the hammer a testament to his own caged frustration. Abigail lit a lantern, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching twilight. She turned to Hayes, her own heart a confusing mix of fear, forgiveness, and a strange, burgeoning trust that defied logic. She waited for him to speak. He took off his hat, turning the sweat-stained brim over and over in his hands. He did not look at her, but at the great anvil that dominated the room, the same anvil where he had placed his badge in a silent promise of protection. He began to speak, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being dragged up from a deep, forgotten well. He told her a story from years ago, before Redwater Ridge, back when he was a special investigator for the railroad, a job that was less about the law and more about the brutal enforcement of the company's will. He spoke of a new line being pushed through hostile territory, of work gangs filled with men trapped by debt and desperation, men held in a state of servitude by a ruthless syndicate that profited from their misery. He had been sent to break that syndicate. He spoke of a passenger train filled with families, that had been taken hostage by the gang's enforcers. They had a simple demand that the railroad and the law look the other way, that they be allowed to continue their operation without interference. The alternative was a massacre. He was leading a small, elite team of railroad security men, outnumbered and outgunned. They had a man on the inside, a low-level enforcer named Caleb Stone, who was willing to talk in exchange for his freedom. The choice, Hayes explained, had been a brutal one. Let 100 innocent people die, or let one guilty man go free to betray the syndicate from within. He had made the trade. He had personally cut Caleb Stone loose in the dead of night, giving him a horse and a head start in exchange for the information that allowed his team to storm the camp and save the train. The railroad buried the official report. It was a victory, but a tarnished one. The loose end, Caleb Stone, was never seen again. And the officer's boots, the military-issue knife, they were part of the standard equipment for his unit. He had worn those same boots, carried that same model of knife, the ghost print by the fence, the clean cut on the rope. They were echoes of a decision he had made half a decade ago. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with the shame of the confession. He suspected that someone from that old case, someone who knew every detail of that night, had resurfaced. Someone who had likely fallen in with Ezra Crowe. A man who would have no qualms about using such a history for his own gain. The legend of Longshot Hayes, the hero who always found a way, was built on a foundation of compromise, a secret trade made in the dark. Abigail listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving his face. She saw the truth of his story not just in his words, but in the profound weariness of his expression. This was the weight he carried every day, the silent cost of his own myth. The town saw a flawless marksman, a legend who single-handedly tamed the Black Antelope gang. She saw a man who had been forced to choose between two impossible wrongs and had been living with the consequences ever since. When he finished, a profound silence filled the smithy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clang of her father's hammer. She did not see a fallen hero. She saw a man, flawed and haunted, who was telling her the unvarnished truth at great personal cost. He was giving her a reason to doubt him, to turn away. She took a step closer to him. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but as steady as the anvil between them. "You are still here," she said. "And this time, we are not trading a man for a train." The words were a release, a statement of faith that cut through his guilt. She was not judging his past. She was standing with him in the present. It was an absolution he had never expected, and it forged a bond between them stronger than iron. With the truth between them, they could now see the enemy's strategy more clearly. This was not just about land. It was about destroying Hayes, using his own history as a weapon. They needed answers, and they knew where to get them. At pumping station number 3, they rode back out as dusk settled. The sky streaked with violet and orange. The air had cooled, and the smell of the damp earth was rich and clean. They tethered their horses a quarter-mile away and approached the pump house on foot, moving through the long shadows. As they drew closer, they heard a slurred, off-key voice, singing a mournful song. They found him sitting on an overturned bucket beside the lean-to, a nearly empty whiskey bottle dangling from his hand. He was one of Crowe's men, a hired guard left behind. A loose end Crowe had not bothered to secure. He was drunk and miserable. Hayes moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving. One moment the man was singing to the rising moon. The next the sheriff was standing over him, his face a hard mask in the twilight. The man's song died in a terrified gurgle. He scrambled for the pistol at his hip, but Hayes's boot was on his wrist before he could even clear the holster. Abigail stood back, the carbine held at the ready, her presence a silent and menacing counterpoint to the sheriff's interrogation. Hayes did not need to raise his voice. He questioned the man in a low, even tone that was more frightening than any shout. He spoke of the penalty for kidnapping, for conspiring with a known criminal enterprise. The drunken bravado evaporated from the guard, replaced by a desperate, sweating fear. The story came tumbling out, The man confirmed everything. Jebediah Turner had been brought here, tied up, and held. The reason for his abduction was a debt. Not his own, but his father's. Apparently, Old Man Turner had taken a loan from Crow years ago, a debt he had never been able to repay before he died. Crow had held on to the note, waiting for the perfect moment to use it as leverage. He had presented it to Jebediah on the night before his wedding, offering a cruel choice: sign the labor contract and disappear, or see Abigail's family name dragged through the mud and the smithy seized to cover the debt. Jebediah had chosen to sacrifice himself. But then the guard's story took a strange turn. He spoke of the hailstorm, how it had come out of nowhere, a divine and terrifying fury. And in the middle of it, a man had appeared, seemingly out of the swirling ice and wind. A stranger, tall and lean, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The stranger had not spoken a word. He had simply raised a rifle, and with a series of shots so fast and accurate the guard swore it was the devil himself. He had shot the locks off the pump-house door and disarmed the other 2 guards without causing a scratch. It was a display of marksmanship that defied belief. This mysterious stranger had then walked over to the terrified Jebediah, cut his ropes with a single, clean slice of a long knife, and pointed towards the dark, jagged slit in the mountains to the north. "Ironbird Canyon," the guard whispered, his eyes wide with remembered awe. The stranger had told Jebediah to run, to hide deep inside the canyon where no one would find him. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he had vanished back into the storm. As the guard described the stranger's impossible shooting, Hayes went very still. He looked at Abigail, and she could see a cold, hard understanding dawning in his eyes. The description was not just of a good marksman. It was a perfect, almost theatrical imitation of the very skills that had earned him the name Longshot. The impossible distances, the calm precision under pressure, the almost supernatural speed. Someone was not just using his past against him. They were wearing his legend like a mask, using his most famous attributes to orchestrate this entire affair, casting him as the secret hero, a move designed to sow confusion and make him the primary suspect in a grand, manipulative scheme. They left the guard tied up, a note pinned to his shirt for Deputy Reed to find in the morning. As they rode away from the pumping station, the moon rose high, illuminating the sharp, menacing silhouette of the mountains ahead. The entrance to Ironbird Canyon was a dark, forbidding gash in the rock, a place of treacherous cliffs and sudden, violent flash floods. It was a natural trap. "Who?" Abigail asked, her voice quiet in the vast stillness of the night. "Who knows you that well?" Hayes was silent for a long time, his mind sifting through the ghosts of his past, through the faces of the men who had ridden with him, fought with him, and known his secrets. Then a name rose to the surface, a name he had not thought of in years, a man who had been part of his team during the hostage crisis, a man who had been a fine shot, but always second best, a man who had been bitter, who felt the railroad had never given him his due, a man who had vanished a year after the incident, rumored to have drifted into work as a hired gun. "Silas Doolin," Hayes said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. "It has to be him. He is working for Crow." They stopped their horses and looked towards the canyon. They were no longer chasing a ghost. They were hunting a man who knew Morgan Hayes better than almost anyone, and who was now using that knowledge to turn a legend into a lie, and a good man into a pawn in a ruthless game. And somewhere, deep inside that dark and dangerous canyon, was Jebediah Turner, the final piece in their deadly puzzle. The entrance to Ironbird Canyon was a wound in the earth, a dark, narrow passage between towering walls of slick, red rock. The storm, which had lashed the plains with hail, now settled into a relentless, driving rain. Thunder cannoned between the canyon walls, each clap a physical blow that vibrated through the stone. For Sheriff Morgan Hayes and Abigail Sutton, riding into that claustrophobic darkness was like entering the belly of a dying beast. They moved as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow, their horses slipping on the wet stone. Water cascaded down the rock faces in muddy waterfalls, and the narrow trail at the bottom of the canyon was already becoming a fast-moving river of reddish-brown sludge. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every echo of the thunder sounded like a gunshot. Hayes rode with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the cliffs above, his face a grim study in concentration. Abigail followed close behind, her own carbine held ready. The lessons he had taught her about calm breathing now a desperate mantra against the chaos of the storm. The world dissolved into a blur of gray rain and red rock. The roar of the water was constant, a deafening, disorienting noise. It was Abigail who heard it first, a sound deeper and more terrible than the thunder, a low, grinding rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. She screamed a warning, but her voice was swallowed by the deluge. Hayes looked up. High above them, a section of the canyon wall seemed to liquefy. A wave of mud, rock, and uprooted brush broke loose and came surging down towards them. A solid, unstoppable tide of earth. There was no time to outrun it. Hayes shoved Abigail and her horse towards a shallow alcove in the rock wall, a meager pocket of shelter. As he tried to wheel his own horse around, the ground beneath its hooves gave way. The animal screamed, fighting for purchase on the slick, crumbling ledge, and then it was gone, swept away in the churning torrent of the mudslide. Hayes had thrown himself clear at the last second, but he was left clinging to a narrow, precarious handhold on the sheer rock face as the river of mud and debris raged just inches below his boots. He tried to pull himself up, but the rain had made the rock as slick as oiled glass. His fingers, numb with cold, began to slip. Abigail watched in horror from the relative safety of the alcove. The man who had been her anchor, her protector, was about to be swept away. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a heartbeat. Then, the training, the resolve, the hard iron core that had been forged in her over the past few days, took over. She scrambled from her horse, untying the thick lariat from her saddle. She worked with a desperate, focused speed, her fingers clumsy but sure, fashioning a loop and bracing herself against a jutting outcrop of rock. She yelled his name, her voice raw. He looked over, his face pale, his grip visibly failing. She swung the rope. Once, twice, the loop sailing through the rain-soaked air. It fell short, slapped down by a gust of wind. She pulled it back, her arms aching, and threw again. This time, it landed perfectly, settling over his head and shoulders. He managed to get one arm through it, cinching it tight just as his other hand lost its grip completely. He swung free, his entire weight crashing against the end of the rope. The force jerked Abigail forward, the rough hemp biting into her hands. Threatening to pull her over the edge with him, she dug her heels into the mud, leaning back with all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest. For a terrifying moment, they were a balanced scale, his life held in her hands. The rope was a taut line of trust between them, a mirror image of the moment he had wrapped his coat around her shoulders, a silent promise now being repaid in kind. Slowly, painfully, she began to walk the rope back, hand over agonizing hand, pulling him from the edge of the abyss until he could find a new foothold and scramble up beside her. They huddled in the alcove, soaked and shivering, the roar of the mudslide gradually subsiding below them. He looked at her, his breathing ragged. He did not say thank you. He did not have to. His eyes, dark and filled with a profound, raw respect, said everything. In that moment, she was not a woman he was protecting. She was his equal. Once the immediate danger had passed, they continued on foot, climbing higher up the canyon wall to avoid the treacherous floor. They finally found him in a shallow salt cave, a place where the air was dry and the walls glittered with faint, crystalline veins. Jebediah Turner was huddled in the back, gaunt and pale, his clothes in tatters, but he was alive. He looked up as they entered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. He saw Abigail, and a look of deep, profound shame crossed his face. The story spilled out of him, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to be free. He told them everything about his late father's hidden debt to Crow, about the cruel ultimatum on his wedding night, about signing the contract in a desperate attempt to protect her family's home and honor. He had not betrayed her out of a lack of love, but from a misguided, desperate excess of it. Then he spoke of the stranger who had freed him, the man who moved like a phantom and shot like a legend, Silas Doolin. He had not known the name, but he described the man's bitter, mocking tone as he had explained the plan. Doolin had told him explicitly that his release was meant to cast suspicion on the sheriff. The goal was to make it seem as though Sheriff Hayes had orchestrated a fake kidnapping just so he could stage a heroic rescue, all to win the affections of the jilted bride. It was a lie so twisted, so diabolical, that it was designed to shatter the town's faith in the law and leave Hayes a hero with no honor. Abigail listened, her heart aching for the gentle, simple man she had almost married. She looked at him, no longer a jilted bride filled with shame, but a woman who understood the terrible complexities of love and sacrifice. She knelt beside him and took his hand. She told him she understood. She told him she forgave him. The relief that washed over his face was a painful thing to see. But in that moment of forgiveness, she also knew, with a sad certainty, that they could never go back. The woman Jebediah had intended to marry no longer existed. She had been burned away in the ashes of a wedding veil, and reforged in the heat of confrontation and the cold terror of the storm. She had learned to stand on her own, to speak for herself, to save the man who had once been her savior. She had to keep walking forward on this new path. She chose to forgive Jebediah, but she could not choose to return to him. They knew they could not stay. Doolin and Crow would not be far behind. They made their way cautiously towards the mouth of the canyon, a place where the narrow passage opened up into a wider, rock-strewn wash. The rain had softened to a miserable, steady drizzle, and a thick mist clung to the ground, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The ambush came without warning. A rifle shot cracked from the rocks above, the bullet whining past Hayes's ear and kicking up a spray of mud. They dove for cover behind a cluster of massive boulders as more shots rang out, echoing eerily in the misty air. Hayes peered around the edge of their shelter and saw him, Silas Doolin, perched high on a ledge, his rifle resting on a rock. The perfect sniper's nest. Below, huddled behind another group of rocks, was Ezra Crow, a pistol clutched in his trembling hand. The gunfight was a chaotic, desperate affair fought in the rain and the mud. Hayes returned fire, his shots precise, forcing Doolin to keep his head down. But Doolin knew his old commander's tactics. He anticipated Hayes's movements, his own shots pinning them down, chipping away at their cover. Hayes knew they were trapped. He told Abigail and Jebediah to make a run for a line of thick brush 50 yards away while he provided cover. He waited for a lull in the shooting, then stood and laid down a volley of rapid-fire shots that sent Doolin scrambling. "Go!" he yelled. Abigail and Jebediah ran, slipping and sliding in the thick mud. They were halfway to the brush when one of Crow's hired guns, hidden from view, rose up from behind a rock directly in their path, his pistol leveled at Jebediah. There was no time to think. Abigail raised the carbine to her shoulder. The world narrowed to the front sight of the rifle. She remembered Hayes's voice. "Slow is how you stay alive." She took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man in her sights grunted, spun around, and fell face down in the mud. It was a single, perfect shot, an act not of vengeance, but of fierce, defiant protection. The shot drew Doolin's attention. Enraged, he rose from his cover, ignoring Hayes, and brought his rifle to bear on Abigail. He saw her now, not as a pawn, but as the true threat. Hayes saw the movement, saw the rifle barrel swing towards her. Without a second's hesitation, He launched himself from behind his cover, moving to put his own body between her and the sniper. The rifle cracked. Hayes cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, as the bullet tore through the flesh of his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to his knees. Doolin smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression. He had him. He chambered another round, taking his time, savoring the moment. But Hayes was not done. He pushed himself up onto one knee, blood soaking the shoulder of his shirt, his left arm hanging useless at his side. He raised his Colt with his right hand, the legendary pistol seeming preternaturally steady despite the pain. The mist swirled, the wind gusted, but he was as calm as if he were on a target range. He fired once. The single shot seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Doolin's smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He staggered backward, his rifle clattering on the rocks, and then he toppled from his ledge, disappearing into the mist below. It was the long shot, the impossible shot, made real by a legend who refused to die. Ezra Crowe watched his hired gun fall, his face a mask of pure panic. The plan was in ruins. He fired one wild, unaimed shot into the air, then turned and fled. Scrambling back up the wash, his greed now eclipsed by his terror. He was not running from the gunfight. He was running back to Redwater Ridge, back to his office, back to the ledgers and contracts that could condemn him. He was running to burn the evidence. The rain began to soften, the mists to thin. The sudden, shocking silence of the canyon was broken only by the drip of water from the rocks and the sound of Hayes's labored breathing. Abigail rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the bleeding wound. Jebediah, saved by her bravery, stood over them, his face pale but his eyes clear with a new and unwavering resolve. He looked from the wounded sheriff to the woman who had saved his life. "I will testify," he said, his voice quiet but firm, ringing with the weight of a promise that would not be broken. "I will tell them everything." They limped back into Redwater Ridge as the first hint of gray was softening the eastern sky. The journey from the canyon had been a slow, arduous trek, with Sheriff Morgan Hayes leaning heavily on Abigail, his face pale and tight with pain, and Jebediah Turner walking with the unsteady gait of a man long deprived of food and hope. The clean, sharp scent of the rain-washed sage was gradually overpowered by another, fouler smell, the acrid stench of smoke. As they crested the last rise, they saw it. A pillar of dark smoke billowed into the dawn sky from the center of town, and a hellish orange glow pulsed against the low clouds. The county records office was burning. The scene on the main street was one of controlled chaos. A human chain, a bucket brigade of ranchers, shopkeepers, railroad workers, and wives, stretched from the rusty waters of the creek to the blazing two-story building. Shouted commands cut through the crackle and roar of the flames, and at the head of the line, her face smudged with soot and her voice hoarse, was May Pike. She was not serving whiskey now. She was directing the town's frantic efforts with the same brisk, no-nonsense authority she used to quell saloon brawls. She had transformed the town's spectators into a single, unified force against the destruction. Their arrival brought a momentary halt to the frantic work. A collective gasp went through the crowd as they saw the three figures emerge from the half-light. Jebediah Turner, alive. Abigail Sutton, no longer a victim but a survivor, her carbine held with a steady familiarity, and Sheriff Hayes, wounded, his shirt soaked with blood, but on his feet and radiating a cold, dangerous calm. Dr. Beasley hurried over, his medical bag in hand, clucking with professional concern. He took one look at the makeshift bandage on Hayes's shoulder and immediately guided him to a bench outside the smithy as the doctor worked, cutting away the bloody fabric. The story of what had happened in Ironbird Canyon was pieced together from the quick, urgent words of the three survivors. The name Silas Doolin meant nothing to the townsfolk, but the name Ezra Crowe landed like a physical blow. They looked from the burning records office to Jebediah's gaunt face. and the ugly tapestry of greed and manipulation was finally revealed in its entirety. Crow was nowhere to be seen. He had not stayed to watch his final, desperate act of destruction. The assumption was that he had fled, a coward vanishing into the wilderness with whatever ill-gotten gains he could carry. But Hayes, even as Dr. Beasley cleaned and stitched his wound, felt a cold knot of unease in his gut. Crow was a man of arrogance. Flight was not his style. This was not over. By the time the sun had fully risen, the fire was contained, though the records office was a smoking, blackened shell, exhausted and grimy. The people of Redwater Ridge began to drift away, not to their beds, but towards the church. It was Sunday, and on this Sunday, more than any other, they felt a collective need for sanctuary, for a place to make sense of the chaos that had torn their town apart. The small wooden church was packed, the pews filled with people still wearing the soot and grime of the fire. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and damp wool. Reverend Whitlow stood at the pulpit, his face etched with weariness and sorrow. He spoke not of damnation, but of bearing false witness, of the poison of greed, and of a community's duty to stand for the truth, even when it was hard. Hayes sat in a front pew, his arm now in a clean sling, the doctor's stitches pulling uncomfortably at his shoulder. Abigail sat beside him, her father on her other side, a few rows back. Jebediah sat with his own family, looking like a ghost in the dim, solemn light. It was in the middle of a hymn that the heavy oak doors of the church were thrown open with a violent crash. Ezra Crow stood there, his fine suit torn and smeared with ash, his hair wild, his eyes holding the frantic, cornered look of a rabid animal. In his hand was a pistol, and he waved it erratically at the stunned congregation. He strode down the aisle, his confident swagger gone, replaced by a desperate, lurching gait. He was not looking for an escape. He was looking for his last asset. He lunged towards the front of the church, grabbing Reverend Whitlow by the collar of his vestments and pressing the barrel of the pistol to the old man's temple. "The land ledger," he snarled, his voice a ragged bark of panic. "The book of deeds! Give it to me now!" A collective intake of breath, a wave of fear, washed through the church. The men and women who had stood bravely against a fire now froze in the face of this single, desperate man and his gun. Hayes rose slowly to his feet, his right hand resting near the butt of his holstered Colt. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the terrified silence. "Let him go. Crow, it is over." Crow laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Over it is over when I say it is. This town is built on my paper, the railroad, the ranches. It is all in that book." It was then that something shifted. Abigail stood up, her face pale, but her eyes clear and unafraid. She was followed by her father, his blacksmith's hands clenched into fists. Then Jebediah rose, taking a half step into the aisle, his presence a living testament to Crow's crimes. One by one, others began to stand. A rancher whose mortgage Crow held, a woman whose husband had been sent to a work camp on a trumped-up debt, old Hank, the stable owner. They did not speak. They did not move forward. They simply stood, a silent, growing wall of condemnation. Deputy Tom Reed, positioned near the side door, drew his own pistol, its click loud in the tense air. Justice was present, but the final blow came from an unexpected quarter. May Pike, who had been sitting near the back, moved with a fluid, deliberate grace. She picked up one of the heavy, polished copper lanterns that gave her saloon its name, a lantern she had donated to the church years ago. She walked calmly up the side aisle until she was almost parallel with Crow. He was distracted, his wild eyes darting between Hayes and the growing crowd of standing townspeople. "Now, Ezra," May said, her voice dripping with a calm, almost bored contempt, "you are making a scene on the Lord's day." And with a flick of her wrist, she swung the heavy lantern in a short, powerful arc. It did not strike him. It swung past his head, the polished copper catching the light from the high church windows and flashing a blinding, brilliant glare directly into his eyes. Crow cried out, instinctively flinching back, his gun hand wavering for a single, crucial second. It was all the opening Hayes needed. He moved with a speed that defied his injury, his right hand a blur as he drew his Colt, not to fire, but to bring the heavy barrel down in a hard, swift blow on Crow's wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor. Deputy Reed surged forward, and the fight was over. There was no need for a trial in a distant courthouse. The verdict was delivered right there, in the house of God, before the community that had been wronged. Jebediah stepped forward, his voice shaking but clear as he described being forced to sign the labor contract under threat of his family's ruin. His words were a condemnation, simple and true. Dr. Beasley then spoke, confirming that the distinctive purple ink on the slanderous leaflets that had shamed Abigail was a precise match to the ink used exclusively in the railroad contracts issued from Ezra Crow's office. Hayes laid the final pieces of evidence on the altar, the brass railroad security badge, and the cleanly cut rope from pumping station number 3, and in Silas Doolin's saddlebags, found on his body at the mouth of the canyon, was a bonus payment receipt, signed by Ezra Crow himself. The evidence was absolute, the guilt undeniable, as Hayes formally declared Ezra Crow under arrest for kidnapping, arson, and conspiracy. A deep, resonant sound began to fill the church. Old Hank had slipped away to the vestibule and had begun to pull the thick rope for the church bell. The bell tolled, not for a service, not for a wedding, but for a judgment. Each resonant peal a declaration of justice reclaimed. In the chaotic aftermath, as Crow was led away in handcuffs, a quiet moment of grace occurred on the church steps. Abigail turned to Jebediah. The crowd gave them space, a respectful silence falling around them. She looked at him, not with pity, but with a deep and honest clarity. "We both kept our promises. Jebediah," she said softly, "you kept your promise to your father, and I learned to keep the promise I made to myself." Tears welled in Jebediah's eyes and streamed down his face, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of release, of being seen and understood, of being granted not scorn, but a profound and liberating respect. He nodded, unable to speak, and in that silent acknowledgement, the last ghost of their shared past was finally laid to rest. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, the people of Redwater Ridge spilled out of the church. The fire was a smoking ruin, a scar on the heart of their town. But the man who had set it was in chains. The community, once fractured by gossip and fear, now stood together, bound by the shared ordeal and the collective courage they had found within themselves. A new day was dawning, and its light fell on the red cliffs, promising a clean, clear, and hard-won beginning. The weeks that followed the fire and the arrest of Ezra Crow were a time of quiet rebuilding for Redwater Ridge. The town, having faced the darkness in its heart, seemed to breathe a different air, cleaner and more resilient. Crow was taken by Deputy Tom Reed to the county seat, where his trial was a swift formality. With the unshakable testimony of Jebediah Turner, the damning evidence presented by Sheriff Hayes, and corroborating accounts from a dozen ranchers Crow had swindled over the years, his conviction was a certainty. The name that had once held the town in a grip of fear and debt became a cautionary tale told to newcomers. The first and most important change in Redwater Ridge was the establishment of the Public Water Council. In a town meeting held in the still smoke-scented church, the citizens voted to manage the Redwater Creek as a shared resource, ensuring no single man could ever again use it as a weapon of greed. The official deed to the Sutton property, clear and undeniable, was the first document ratified by the new council. Its legitimacy guaranteed not by a distant court, but by the will of the community itself. Life found a new rhythm. Jebediah Turner, his face having regained some of its lost color and his eyes holding a quiet dignity, came to the smithy one last time before he left, the railroad, in an effort to distance itself from Crow's corruption. had offered him an honest position as a foreman on a new line being built 2 territories over. He told Abigail and her father that his first wages, and every wage after, would go towards repaying the last of his father's debt. It was a matter of honor. There was no lingering awkwardness between him and Abigail, only a gentle, shared understanding. They had both survived the same fire, and it had forged them into different people. They wished each other well. A simple and sincere farewell that closed a chapter of their lives without bitterness. Sheriff Morgan Hayes, his shoulder healing into a neat, puckered scar, undertook his own quiet act of reckoning. He spent 2 long nights in his office, writing his official report on the Crow affair. He detailed every crime, from the forced labor contract to the arson, but then he wrote a lengthy addendum. In it, he laid bare the entire story of the hostage train incident from 5 years prior, withholding nothing. He detailed his decision to release the informant, Caleb Stone, and acknowledged that this past action had created the ghost, Silas Doolin, who had brought such terror to his town. He signed the report, sealed it, and sent it with the circuit judge, knowing it could very well be the end of his career. A month later, a package arrived from the territorial capital. It was not a letter of dismissal. Inside a small wooden box was a new sheriff's badge, its silver polished to a brilliant shine. Pinned to the velvet lining was a short, handwritten note from the judge. It said, "Only this. The law has enough legends. What it needs are honest men." Hayes pinned the new star to his vest. It felt lighter than the old one. The smithy, once a place of quiet, masculine grief, was now a hub of bustling activity. A new, larger sign hung over the wide doors. It no longer read just Sutton Blacksmith. The bold, clean letters now proclaimed Sutton and Company, Smithy and Stables. Abigail had used her savings, and a loan from a grateful May Pike, to purchase the adjoining lot. With the help of her father and old Hank, she had built a small but sturdy stable, offering services for shoeing, boarding, and breaking horses. She had taken Jebediah's simple dream and reshaped it into her own. She was no longer just the blacksmith's daughter. She was a businesswoman, a respected figure in the new Redwater Ridge. The seasons turned. The heat of the long summer softened into the crisp, golden days of autumn. The cottonwood trees along the creek turned a brilliant yellow, and the evenings grew cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine from the high country. One such evening, long after the sun had set behind the red cliffs, the forge in the smithy was still glowing. Abigail was finishing a delicate piece of ironwork, a set of ornate hinges for the new church doors. Her hammer blows precise and rhythmic. Morgan Hayes sat on a nearby stool, not speaking, simply watching her work. He had taken to ending his days here, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship a welcome solace after his long patrols. His presence was a comfortable, unspoken part of her new routine. When she was finished, she quenched the hot iron in a barrel of water, the hiss of steam filling the air. She set down her hammer and looked at him, a small, tired smile on her face. He smiled back. He stood and came to her side, and together they walked to the large water trough just outside the doors. The night was clear and cold, the sky a vast canopy of stars. Abigail pulled off her heavy leather work gloves, laying them on the edge of the trough. He did the same. She plunged her hands into the icy water, scrubbing away the day's grime. He washed his own hands beside hers, their arms brushing, the simple, domestic act more intimate than any grand gesture. She looked around at the expanded yard, at the warm light spilling from the smithy, at the dark, solid shape of the new stables. "The house," she said, her voice soft in the quiet night. "It is no longer silent." He turned to her, his expression gentle in the starlight. He reached out, his clean hand covering hers, his touch warm against her cold, wet skin. "Because it has your voice," he answered. He drew her closer, and she went willingly. His kiss was not like the first one they had shared in the desperate shelter of the storm. This kiss was slow and sure and deep with the weight of all they had endured and all they had become. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise of a future built not on a flawless legend, but on the flawed, honest, and resilient strength of two people who had found their way through the darkness together. It was the quiet, certain beginning of a new story. Later, as the fire in the forge burned down to glowing embers, Abigail walked over to the rough wooden mantelpiece above the hearth. She picked up a small, neatly folded square of paper that had been sitting there for months. It was the poster, the hateful public declaration of her deepest shame. She had almost forgotten it was there. She held it for a moment, the cheap paper a flimsy relic of a past that no longer had any power over her. She walked to the forge and, without ceremony, tossed it onto the red-hot coals. The paper unfolded in the intense heat, the bold, black letters curling and blackening for a final, fleeting moment. Betrayed, legendary, love. The words dissolved into a wisp of smoke and a brief, bright flicker of orange flame. And then they were gone, consumed and purified by the fire. Morgan came and stood beside her, his arm settling comfortably around her shoulders. She leaned into his strength, watching the last of the embers fade, together. They opened the wide smithy doors, and a cool, clean wind swept in from the dark canyons, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a new day. The life that lay ahead of them was as vast and unknown as the starry Wyoming sky, and they were ready to meet it. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people discover this tale.